This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On the 1st of April, the RCMI held its first Vimy Dinner in cooperation with the Toronto Police Service Military Veterans Association. Our speaker was Honorary Lieutenant Colonel Jeannette Chau of the 7th Toronto Regiment, Royal Canadian Artillery. Her topic was the Guns of Vimy.
As a 16-year-old, my father... Thank you. I knew that there's always someone that's going to do that for me, so certainly appreciate it. But it's important to note that as a 16-year-old, myself, my father gifted me a new copy, excuse me, of Pierre Berton's military history, simply called Vimy. I went on to read how young men, the same age as I at the time that I was reading, on one chilled Easter dawn in 1917, with a blizzard blowing in their faces, and as part of the 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps, went over the top of a muddy scarp known as Vimy Ridge. They were to hold within their grasp, which had eluded both the British and the French armies in over 2 years of fighting. They had indeed seized the best defended German bastion on the Western Front. 30 years later, I personally walked the ridge for the first time. And in doing so, like many others, I imagined what it would have been like to have been present, to have endured the horrific conditions, to have fought and to have clung to life, and to have felt the shake of the earth from the non-stop bombardment of the artillery. This evening, we are incredibly fortunate to have with us Honorary Lieutenant Colonel Jeannette Chau of the 7th Toronto Regiment to speak to this artillery and its evolution leading up to the battle that would become our defining moment to a country that we stand proudly for today. Honorary Lieutenant Colonel Chau, I would invite you to the podium.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. We're gathered here today to commemorate Vimy and the fallen. Many of you are already familiar with the famous events that have happened at Vimy, so I'm not going to go into great detail on all the individual battles, but I was honored to receive a call from Dana Gidlow, who invited me to come and speak on the role of the artillery in particular. And as you heard before, there were many advancements that happened in the artillery, which enabled the success of the battles. It was these advancements and the close coordination between the infantry and the artillery that enabled the victory. So a bit of background on Vimy Ridge. It was a ridge that formed a barrier 15 kilometers long across the western edge of the Dow Plain. The ridge had been taken and occupied by the Germans, as we heard earlier tonight. And from the crest, the Germans could see all the daytime movement, so it was very difficult to take. The French and then the British had tried, and the French alone had lost 100,000 casualties from that. And now it was the Canadians' turn to try. So the plan. I'm going to give you a quick overall summary of the plan. It was developed by General Julian Byng and his largely British staff. For the first time, as you heard, all 4 Canadian divisions would be attacking in a line on a front of 15 kilometers. The attack had 4 objectives, each indicated by a line: the black line, the red, the blue, and the final brown line. Massive artillery support for the attack would hammer enemy positions for 2 weeks preceding and during the attack would creep ahead of the Canadian infantry. And as you heard before, that was the creeping barrage. So in terms of innovations, so General Byng knew that as soon as they began their artillery barrage, the Germans would probably fire right back. But what if they could locate the enemy positions first and take them out? So what they did was establish a counter battery, which is essentially the use of artillery against enemy artillery. 29-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Andrew McNaughton was the one who was put in charge of this counter battery. He was a militia soldier. He was also an electrical engineer and a professor at McGill University before he went to the war. He was put in charge, and he was considered a bit of an oddball. He slept on the floor, and he had a pet lion cub, which had been rescued from the French zoo because they could no longer feed them. He was a perfectionist, and he took his technical lead from such scientists such as Lawrence Bragg, who was a 25-year-old Nobel Prize winner in physics in 1915. So this Nobel Prize winner had been commissioned into the Royal Horse Artillery and brought specifically to the Western Front to help develop the British gunnery and look at ways of fighting artillery against enemy artillery. So one of the techniques they developed was flash spotting. When enemy artillery fired, the Canadians would see a large flash. Even if they couldn't see the gun, they measured the distance of the flash. By measuring from 3 different locations, they could pinpoint exactly where the enemy was using the method of triangulation. Another new technique that was used was developing sound ranging. It was a method for pinpointing the position of enemy artillery by recording the boom of the enemy artillery with using an array of microphones. By measuring the difference of the time of arrival of the round to the microphone, of the sound to the microphone locations on various sensor posts in the trenches, they were able to calculate the bearing of where that sound came from. In other words, where the enemy gun was. Now, one of the reasons why the Canadian Corps was able to advance so rapidly in the field of counter battery was because the staff was receptive to the new ideas and to trying new things. So shortly after the Battle of the Somme, there was a group of scientists that were sent over from England to look at how can we work against the enemy artillery. And their proposal was to take such delicate instruments such as an oscillograph into the reserve line of the trenches, met with a lot of skepticism. The others were saying, well, this is madness. We're going to bring this to our trenches. So they didn't get a good reception. But in the Canadian Corps, however, the scientists received a warm welcome. The engineers fixed them up with comfortable accommodations. Most importantly of all, they were listened to. And as a result, it was the Canadian Corps, out of the different formations there, that received the best service. So it pays to be a nice Canadian. So with these techniques, before long, the counter battery was able to determine the position of a German gun within 22 meters, and the caliber and size of the gun within under 3 minutes. Okay. Aerial reconnaissance was also an area where they advanced, using visual and aerial reconnaissance to locate hostile artillery. Camera-carrying aircraft were available, and as you can see, here he is. The camera's attached to the side of the plane, and he's just reaching out to take those photographs. They also used aerial balloons, and here's a photo of an aerial balloon ready to take flight. And there's a story about McNaughton himself, who was up in an aerial balloon one day when the Germans opened fire on him. He was able, because he was very experienced, to quickly relay the coordinates back, and they were able to neutralize the gun and save himself and his troops. You heard about the new 106 fuse earlier. That was a very new technological development that greatly, greatly contributed to the Canadian success at Vimy. And it was the widespread use of this 106 fuse in high explosive shells that were the cause. This fuse made shells explode on contact with barbed wire, blowing large holes in it. So as you heard before previously from the other fellow, that when they had the shells, they would explode on contact. So you would have a great big crater in the ground, but the barbed wire would still be left intact. Now, with this, it drew on French technology. On the fuse, there was a spindle, and the spindle had a little long hammer that protruded. When the spindle was depressed inward slightly, it would cause the fuse to detonate. And so then if it hit something, for example, like the barbed wire, it would detonate and explode and then break up the barbed wire. Okay. So in preparation for the battle, except for the foremost areas, what they did, instead of totally destroying all the barbed wire, the gunners went and cut lanes through the entanglements so that the advancing infantry would be able to get through. They were cut a little bit by bit at a time by the 106 fuse, and while others of the batteries would fire just enough harassing fire so the Germans couldn't get out to repair it. Another thing, new development, were the wear adjustments, and that was looking at the gun barrels, being able to measure the wear of them, and to be able to adjust the aim so that they could still aim accurately. So those were the technical innovations. What about the tactical innovations? Okay. The creeping barrage was the most important one that was used in the battle, and which became known as the Vimy glide. The creeping barrage meant that the shell fire would creep ahead of the infantry with the soldiers advancing behind the bombardment. At Vimy, the artillery shelling moved forward 100 yards every 3 minutes. This meant that soldiers had 3 minutes to catch up with the barrage and silence any defenders left. Major Alan Brooke was the 33-year-old mastermind behind the rolling barrage. There was one field gun to every 25 yards of front provided by the creeping barrage. 3 minutes at 3 rounds a minute on the foremost enemy trenches, and then 100-yard lifts every 3 minutes at a rate of 2 rounds a minute. The men would advance and wait for the firing to stop, and the guns would then aim for their next target, and another group of men would advance once again. If they moved too quickly, they would be killed by their own guns. If they moved too slowly, the enemy would recover and then begin firing at them. As General Julian Byng told them, "Chaps, you shall have to go exactly over like a railroad train on the exact time, or you shall be annihilated." The artillery conquers and the infantry occupies. That was the principle underlying the plans of the assault. And I have a wonderful map here of the barrage, similar to the map that you saw earlier. This is a print, and it shows all the barrage lines. This was very generously loaned for us tonight by Colonel Jim Hubble, who is here in the audience today, and he brought that along for us to be able to take a look at that. So after the dinner, you're welcome to come in and have a look. Okay. Another little tactic that was used is known as the gunner stunt, and it was thought that it had originated at Vimy, and it was also used in World War II. So it was known that there was a prominent church spire behind the Canadian lines that the Germans were using to register or use as a reference point for their guns. The tower was carefully dismantled one dark night and then rebuilt exactly as it had been before, but on a new site far away enough to throw all the German guns registering on them several degrees off their target. Turning the tables. Another helpful plan was the use by the Canadians of captured German guns. During the winter, the Canadian gunners received special training on the handling of German artillery. So during the attack, the number of abandoned or captured guns were able to be speedily put into action by the Canadian gunners. In some cases, the German guns were taken with as much as 10,000 rounds of ammunition per gun already there for use. So the guns. Let's talk about the guns. There were various pieces. Counting all the heavy pieces of the bombardment and counter battery groups, there was 1 to every 25 yards of core frontage. And the final and very important change, which contributed greatly to the victory, was the closer and smarter coordination between infantry and artillery. It was one of the most rehearsed and best organized attack of World War I. Every step of the battle was timed and practiced. Every division had a thick, typewritten volume, carefully guarded, that covered every conceivable operation. Maps were given to all the troops, as you heard. The artillery had the Canadian Corps Artillery Instructions No. 1 for the capture of Vimy Ridge. It was a 35-page document that divided into 4 distinct phases the actions of the artillery. Artillery Phase 1. Phase 1 was the preliminary bombardment, which consisted of harassing fire. In Artillery Phase 2, the bombardment was intensified. Guns that had been concealed from the enemy came into action, and shells rained down. The Germans called it the week of suffering. The artillery also carried out sham attacks, creating barrages that seemed to signal attack or sudden intensifications in certain areas, so it would throw the enemy off guard. At the same time, the mock creeping barrages helped provide useful practice rehearsals for the participating batteries. The Germans could hardly move for fear of sudden death. By the end of the second week, more than 1 million rounds, with a total weight of 50,000 tons, had battered the area of the German-built holdings into a pockmarked wilderness of mud-filled craters. The counter battery during the week of suffering was responsible for eliminating 83% of an estimated 212 German guns. Artillery Phase 3 covered the bombardment to be fired in support of the attack. 0 hour had been set for 5:30 a.m. on the morning of April 9th, Easter Monday. And during the preceding hours of darkness, there was a perceptible slackening of the bombardment. This reduction served a twofold purpose. One was to throw the enemy off guard. They were puzzled by why was this happening. And the second was to allow the gunners to prepare for the oncoming barrage. They were preparing and sorting their fuses, getting extra supplies and springs. They had barrels of water to help cool the guns, and they didn't want anything to be able to stop the barrage once they started. 4 seconds before 0, all the guns abruptly ceased firing. There was an eerie, awe-inspiring silence. Then the silence was shattered, and the sky was lit by the flashes of 1,000 guns and the thunderous roar of shell fire. It was the greatest artillery barrage in the history of warfare. The soldiers went over the top of the trenches and began their attack in blowing sleet, in strict time to the creeping barrage. Whoops. The far-off booming of the guns could even be heard in England. Artillery Phase 4, the last phase of artillery operations, involved the movement of the field batteries forward to support the final advance. Now, there were some silent batteries that had been put up in advanced positions so that when it came to the final barrage, they were able to take over and do the firing to allow time for the other field batteries to move up into position. By mid-afternoon, the final brown line was secure. Unfortunately, on the left side, a portion of the German trenches was left undestroyed. And this was because it was at the specific request of a commanding officer of the assaulting battalion. He had asked that the barrage not destroy those trenches because he had hoped to use them as cover for his own troops once they had taken it. However, they were not able to capture the trench, and the intact Germans used it and used their machine gun fire from this position and broke up the 11th Brigade attack. The barrage had to be repeated on the 10th, whereupon they gained the objective at the red line on the left. 2 days later, the Canadian and British forces had taken all their objectives, and the battle for Vimy Ridge was won. So the Battle of Vimy Ridge was the greatest victory of World War I. However, it came at a great cost. During the battle, 3,598 Canadians were killed, and more than 7,000 were wounded. And they spoke before of the etching of the names. This is a photograph that I took when I was at Vimy, and that's a photo of the exact inscriptions, and that is the statue that overlooks the plain. April 9, 1917 still stands as the bloodiest day in our military history. Worse than Beaumont-Hamel in 1916, worse than Dieppe in 1942, and worse than D-Day in 1944. In fact, worse than all three combined. The artillery contributed to the victory through technical innovations, the sound ranging, the flash spotting, the aerial reconnaissance, the number 106 fuse to cut through barbed wire, and being able to measure and adjust the aiming for wear. And the improved tactics like the creeping barrage, the gunner's stunt, utilizing captured German artillery, and the detailed planning and close coordination with the infantry. But this victory would not have been able to have achieved, though, without the heroic efforts and bravery of the many infantry and other divisions which took part. I've focused on the role of the artillery, as I was asked to speak on this as a representative of the gunners, but I hope I've shown you a little bit of a different aspect of the battle. The Canadian Corps as a whole had distinguished themselves, and the Toronto Police had brave members who took part and we're here today as well to pay tribute to them as our partners in arms. The French had thought that taking Vimy Ridge was not possible. The Canadians showed them, c'est possible. Vive les Canadiens. Merci beaucoup. Lest we forget. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would call upon RCMI President, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Clary, please.
Colonel Chau, I'd like to thank you for a couple of things. First of all, accepting the task of doing this presentation, and secondly, of doing such a wonderful job with it. I think most of us have some familiarity, some of the details or history of Vimy Ridge, but your presentation filled in a lot of the blanks and gave us some much better understanding of how the artillery was involved in such a great achievement. So, on behalf of the Royal Canadian Military Institute, I would like to present you with one of our official coins, and thanks for a great presentation.
And thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to call upon Toronto Police Military Veterans Association President, Mr. Dana Gidlow, please.
We truly stand on the shoulders of some amazing Canadians. I grew up understanding what Vimy meant through my father, through my grandfather. So I understand very much what Vimy Ridge and how it impacted on our country. April the 9th, 1917 is the darkest day of Toronto police history, in that in one day we lost 4 police officers. After the Great War, it was time for the veterans to pick up the pieces of their civilian lives. The experiences they endured will shape the rest of their lives. In 1920, several veterans serving with the Toronto Police established our association. The founding principles, simple and yet resonate with us today. Today, as it was then, it was service to our comrades, the families of the fallen, and to the broader Toronto community that we are sworn to serve and protect. The second principle of our founding was remembrance, that the deaths of so many would not be forgotten. And to this end, we speak the names of our fallen out loud several times a year. When police officers gather, their names are spoken. Tonight, we remember 4 police officers who made the supreme sacrifice, and they will represent all of our fallen tonight. That's the Sergeant at Arms, and I ask to be joined by my historian, Mr. Scarlino. So in keeping with our traditions, we will conduct a Toronto Police roll call.
Police Constable William Henry Haynes, badge number 451. Police Constable William Henry Haynes,
badge number 451, is absent with cause. Chief.
William Henry Haynes, Police Constable number 451, of number 9 station in the Keele Street and Dundas Street West area. He lived at 518 Church Street with his wife Lily and their 4 children. On January 28, 1916, Constable Haynes enlisted with the 180th Battalion Sportsmen in Toronto. He sailed to England on the SS Olympic. He arrived in November 1916 for further training. In February 1916, Haynes landed in France, where he joined the 75th Battalion at Mississauga Canadian Expeditionary Force. He arrived as a replacement and proceeded to the front. On Easter Monday, April 9, 1917, Haynes was killed in action at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Constable William Henry Haynes lies buried at Canadian Cemetery No. 2, Neuville-Saint-Vaast, France.
Police Constable Robert Cunningham Clark, badge number 540.
Robert Cunningham Clark, Police Constable number 540 of the Toronto Police Force, was a single young man who lived at 129 Alexander Street. He had previously been a police officer with the Royal Irish Constabulary. On September 10, 1915, Constable Clark enlisted with the 92nd Battalion, 48th Highlanders of Canada. He proceeded to England on the SS Empress of Britain for further training. Clark landed in France in August 1916, where he was transferred to the 42nd Battalion, Royal Highlanders of Canada. He proceeded to the front. On November 4th, 1916, Clark survived a gunshot wound to the head. He was evacuated to the hospital, recovered, was deemed fit for duty, and sent back to the front. On Easter Monday, April 9th, 1917, Clark was killed in action at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Constable Robert Cunningham Clark lies buried at Givenchy-en-Goël Cemetery in France.
Police Constable Andrew Johnson, badge number 874.
Police Constable Andrew Johnson, badge number 874, is absent with cause. Chief.
Andrew Johnson, Police Constable 374 of number 6 Police Station at Queen Street West and Cowan Avenue, was a single young man who lived at 64 Brock Street. On April 15, 1915, Constable Johnson enlisted in the 83rd Battalion, Queen's Own Rifles. He sailed to England on the SS Olympic in April 1916, and in February 1917, reached France and was transferred to the 75th Battalion. On Easter Monday, April 9, 1917, Johnson was shot through the hip, and owing to the heavy shell fire, he was unable to be rescued. He died of his wounds. With no known grave, Constable Andrew Johnson is commemorated on the Canadian National Vimy Memorial in France.
Police Constable Samuel Henry McGowan, badge number 274.
Police Constable Samuel Henry McGowan, badge number 274, is absent with cause. Chief.
Samuel Henry McGowan, Police Constable number 274, served at number 1 Police Station at Church Street and King Street East. He was a single young man who lived at 733 Markham Street with his brother Hugh. On February 16, 1916, Constable McGowan enlisted with Toronto's 180th Battalion, the Sportsmen, and in November 1916 sailed to England on the SS Olympic. In February 1917, McGowan landed in France and was transferred to the 75th Battalion. On Easter Monday, April 9, 1917, McGowan was killed in action at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Constable Samuel Henry McGowan lies buried at Canadian Cemetery No. 2, Neuville-Saint-Vaast, France. Ladies and gentlemen, please raise your glasses. Robert Cunningham Clark, William Henry Haynes, Andrew Johnson, and Samuel Henry McGowan. They fell with their faces to the foe, to the fallen. They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
I would ask that you please remain standing and ready your glass for the final toast of the evening, a toast to the people of the Ukraine. The toast will be given by Lieutenant Colonel Terry Pitch. The response to the toast will be given by Chief Myron Demke.
Szanowni gości, panie i panowie, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the Toronto Police Association, Military Veterans Association for allowing me to toast the land of my forefathers in their fight for freedom and independence. Slava Ukraini!
I would like to invite the Chief of the Toronto Police Service, Chief Myron Demke, to the podium for the evening's final remarks.
So these will be very brief remarks, because I know I think everybody would like to find their way to the long bar for some further conversation. But I think it bears just to take a moment and reflect on some of the comments today. We are remembering incredible loss, but I couldn't help but think when the Honorary Lieutenant Colonel spoke, the incredible tradition of innovation, leadership, and courage that Canadians demonstrated that day. And when I look around this room and see people in service in uniform, I know that we can all look in our individual environments and see the continued tradition, Canadian tradition of innovation, leadership, and courage that's represented by everybody who's here today. So I'd also just take a moment and reflect on Mr. Gidlow's comments. Policing right now is going through an incredible, tragic time in modern history where we are burying police officers at an unprecedented rate in this country. But we are here to reflect on the loss of 4 Toronto police officers on the bloodiest day in Toronto police history. And I think when I think back at the history we're reflecting on in today's context, it's incredibly important for us to carry on the tradition of remembering and honoring the fallen and saying their names so that we will not ever forget. And I'll close by acknowledging Mr. Goldsworthy and, of course, the Honorary Lieutenant Colonel Chau for your incredible passion, dedication to keeping the history alive and keeping us aware of the history and the significance of these historical moments that we're here reflecting on. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that one of the comments made at the very beginning of the evening is the need to carry on the tradition of remembering to our young. And today we are joined by a young man, Matteo, who I understand is celebrating his 11th birthday today. Matteo, thank you. Happy birthday, and thank you for joining us here today to remember this very important history.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.